What's shaking and baking, all you hip cool cats? My name is Kit. This is Americans Learn, and today we have ourselves a special request. That's right. If you're a patron supporter and you support the channel, you will get a special video request. And there are people asking us, and I want to get the name properly right, so that way I can acknowledge our wonderful viewers and subscribers for obviously one, helping us build this channel up, and more importantly that we are able to continue to do all the great work. So this was requested by Nenber Pterodactylus. So Nenber Pterodactylus, because, there you go. All right, so always a huge fan of our viewers and subscribers, because after all, we here at Americans Learn are very grateful for our viewing audience. All of you are helping us build up this channel. And so without further ado, the video we're checking out is called What Will Finland Bring to NATO? A Warographics analysis. Now, listen, I know a lot of you, I've occasionally dropped some Warhammer 40k references, but seeing as how we are ever tiptoeing closer to the sequel we've all been dreading, World War III, I'm hoping for peace in our time. I would love to visit Japan again before the whole world catches on fire. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and check this video out. This video is from Warographics, so let's go ahead and check it out. The original link to this video is in the description box below. So let's enjoy this video in a 3, a 2, and an uno.
Today's video is brought to you by Enlisted. More about them in a bit. It was the exact outcome Vladimir Putin had been hoping to prevent. When the Russian autocrat announced his full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, one of his stated goals was to halt the eastward expansion of NATO, to ensure that no other European country would ever again seek shelter beneath the alliance's nuclear umbrella. Instead, his unprovoked war achieved the exact opposite. On the 4th of April 2023, NATO officially welcomed Finland as its 31st member. With the handing over of documents and raising of the Finnish flag, the Kremlin suddenly found itself with an extra 1,300 kilometers of NATO territory on its border, the alliance's largest physical expansion since 2004. In the couple of weeks since, endless articles have been written about Putin's grand strategic failure. Yet it's not just thanks to geography that Finland's accession has been such a failure for Moscow. It's also thanks to Helsinki's fielding one of the best militaries in Europe. Despite having a population of just 5.54 million, Finland's army is high-tech, experienced, and capable of quickly calling up over 250,000 troops. In today,
can't we have diplomatic talks? Just throwing it out there, just because I just don't see this going the way anyone wants it. And trust me on it, when those nukes drop, I don't care who pushes the button. Once those nukes drop, that's it. We're never getting back to this. Say goodbye to cell phones, say goodbye to internet, and whatever remains of humanity will be nothing but a husk of its shell. There will be no great reconstruction, and radiation doesn't disappear overnight. The survivors will envy the dead, to quote Dr. Strangelove.
Today's video, we're analysing the strength of NATO's newest army and discussing exactly what Finnish accession means for the alliance and for Russia. On the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a small number of polling companies turned their attention to Moscow's northwest neighbour to see what the Finns thought of NATO membership. By then, Finland had been a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace initiative for 28 years. For 27 of those years, Helsinki had also been a part of the alliance's planning and review process. In fact, NATO and Finland worked so closely together that the Nordic country was often described as being, quote, as close to NATO as a country can be without being an actual member. Yes, in those weeks before Putin unleashed his genocidal war, it seemed that actually joining the alliance was a step Helsinki would never take. Polls showed NATO accession to be deeply unpopular, supported by barely a third of the population. In many ways, this wasn't a surprise. Decades of polling had never shown a majority in favour. At that point, it looked like Finland would continue charting its neutral course for decades to come. And then, on the 24th of February 2022, everything changed. Images of missiles raining down on Kiev didn't just transform politics in Ukraine and the NATO alliance. In Helsinki, too, the unprovoked Russian assault turned everything on its head. When polling companies checked back in March, they found support for Finland joining NATO had leapt to 60%. By May, more than 3/4 of the population were clamoring for shelter beneath the nuclear umbrella. When Finland's parliament voted on a cession, only 8 out of 200 members rejected the bill. Fast forward to today, and all major parties support Helsinki's new place in the alliance, along with over 80% of voters. All of which begs the question, what happened? How did Putin's failed war of aggression so completely galvanize public opinion? And the answer lies in Finland's tortured history. For nearly 110 years, starting in 1809, Finland suffered the same fate that befell so many regions in the 19th century. It was colonized, in this case by the Russian Empire. While other parts of the empire would experience strict Russification, though, the Grand Duchy of Finland was always allowed a degree of autonomy. It maintained its own senate, for example. Still, that doesn't mean things were rosy. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, the Finns were among those nationalities that headed for the exit, all of which sets up nicely for modern Finland's foundational story, the Winter War. Now, we already did a full-length video on the Winter War about a year ago, so we're not going to go into too many details here. The basic version is that in 1939, the USSR invaded Finland, hoping to crush that whole independence thing, only for Finland to turn what should have been a Soviet cakewalk into a catastrophe. Although Helsinki was ultimately defeated, the Finns inflicted so many casualties that Stalin was forced to settle for taking a slice of territory and letting Finland remain independent. When the two sides fought another war later in World War II, the outcome was mostly the same. In this way, Finland managed to guarantee it wouldn't become another Soviet colony. Sadly, it also wouldn't manage to be truly independent. The Cold War term for what happens next was Finlandization. Based on a 1948 treaty with the USSR, it forced Finland to swear strict neutrality, rejecting ever joining NATO and allowing the Soviets final say in much of the nation's foreign policy.
I just can't help but looking at that photo, thinking of the great film Death of Stalin. Just overall the madness and insanity of it. Now, of course, to our viewing friends in Finland, obviously this is a very interesting situation. And I know that there's been an ongoing back and forth, a bloody history between Russia and Finland, of course, and with this conflict still happening in Ukraine and it's still ongoing, it doesn't look like it's going to be ending anytime soon for either side. What's the overall general feeling? Because I know that this video is about 11 months old. So have views changed? Has people's perceptions changed in regards to this? Or is the feeling overall still tense? I know I'm still feeling tense because there's going to be some dumb idiot looking at that shiny red button called nuke, and you might have somebody wondering, what does this button do? And no, exterminatus is not the answer.
In other words, it was a halfway house between freedom and colonization. Not quite a return to the Grand Duchy of Finland days, but hardly independence as most of us would understand it. And that's how things more or less remained until the collapse of the USSR. For the Finnish government, the post-Cold War era was the first time since World War II that they'd tasted full sovereignty. Almost as if to celebrate, they joined the EU in 1995. Despite this general westward shift, though, they never joined NATO. Partly this was to avoid angering Russia. Partly it was because Helsinki felt it didn't need the added protection. Strong defense cooperation with its neighbor Sweden meant Finland could field one of the most high-tech militaries on the continent. And besides, this was the post-Cold War era. The idea of a large European state attacking a smaller neighbor was a thing of the past. Right? Sadly, now we know that wasn't the case. The invasion of Ukraine made it clear to Finns that another winter war was a realistic possibility. And this time, Helsinki didn't want to be holding off the Russian bear alone. So, you ready to take command of a squad of soldiers and fight in massive battles with hundreds of targets? Then look no further than Enlisted, the new first-person shooter game from Darkflow Software. Enlisted offers a unique gaming experience by combining PvP with PvE combat. You can play through multiple campaigns, each featuring their own unique weapons, vehicles, and equipments. From the outskirts of Moscow in 1941 to the heart of Berlin in 1945, the campaigns are so varied that they kind of feel like individual games. Look, Enlisted is approachable for all audiences with realistic movement and a target-rich environment. And also, casual players can still have an important role on the battlefield. I am a very casual player, and it's nice to be included. And with over 100 weapons, tanks, and aircraft, there is a massive arsenal of equipment to unlock. So, you can customize and upgrade your individual soldier class from riflemen with bolt-action rifles to engineers building anti-tank fortifications. The graphics and detail in Enlisted are incredible. The authentic sounds add a huge amount of realistic weapons, vehicles, environments. Personally, I've been enjoying the Normandy campaign, the landing at Omaha Beach. Pretty intense, pretty immersive experience, and the interactions between aircraft, tanks, and soldiers were all rather exciting. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below, or go to playen.link/Warographics to play Enlisted now on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, or the previous generation of console, and you'll receive a free bonus pack with multiple weapons, soldiers, and a premium account. Join the battle.
Sounds awesome.
Today with Enlisted, and now back to today's video. Although Finland may have joined NATO in the hopes of deterring Russian aggression, the alliance didn't open the door out of the goodness of Jens Stoltenberg's heart. Those at NATO headquarters in Brussels knew they'd be getting something special out of the deal: a highly competent military with eye-watering manpower reserves. On paper, Finland's defense forces seem small, a mere fraction of what other militaries are capable of fielding. Around 19,000 troops are serving at any given time, with an extra 3,000 or so in the border guard. Given that both Ukraine and Russia currently have 1 million men under arms, this is a seriously tiny amount, barely a rounding error compared to Kiev's or Moscow's forces. But these are just Finland's active duty personnel. Were a war to break out, Helsinki can scale up. It can scale up fast. At the end of the Cold War, most European armies that still used conscription abolished that model, switching instead to smaller armies made up of professional soldiers. But not Finland. Even as the Swedes were like, yay, the Cold War's over, let's give young people freedom to drive.
Sounds good.
Their Volvos, the Finns, well, they kept conscription going. Every year, the military trains 22,000 conscripts. Constitutionally, every Finnish man between ages 18 and 60 must serve, while Finnish women can do so on a voluntary basis. That means Helsinki has a huge pool of potential fighters that it can draw on. In event of general mobilization, that small Finnish army would quickly balloon to 280,000, with an additional 900,000 held in reserve. That's a larger army than Germany can field, and Germany has a population of 83 million. Finland's entire population of 5.45 million could fit inside the Berlin metropolitan region. Of course, we're currently witnessing a war in which mobilized reservists have played a huge role, and the results, to put it mildly, have not been encouraging. On April 2nd, 2023, the UK MOD detailed how mobilized Russians are often too drunk to competently fight. The big difference is that Russia's conscription model is inherently corrupt, funneling the poor into a nasty system that brutalizes them while the rich and connected easily opt out.
Everyone does it. Everyone does it. There's corruption everywhere. And if there's going to be the sequel we all dread, trust me on it. We're all going to be on it together. All as poor folk, no matter what side you're on. The rich are going to be very comfortable, to which I have to say, perhaps, look, I'm a fan of alternate history, different dimensions, different theories, but perhaps maybe in some alternate universe, perhaps maybe during the Christmas truce, in the early days of World War I, perhaps the soldiers didn't go back to their fighting lines. Perhaps instead they started talking to each other a little bit more, ignoring their commanders, and perhaps they all came down to the same conclusion. Hey, y'all got rich folk telling you to fight and die for some BS reason? We got them too. And perhaps maybe that was the beginning of a great global get-together where they finally got those bastards and kicked their teeth in. Perhaps, maybe, on that world. Just not here. There's corruption and evil everywhere, folks. It comes in many forms, and sometimes it comes in the form of a smiling face.
By contrast, the Finnish system is equitable, and it places strict emphasis on lifelong rehearsals to maintain combat readiness. After an initial service of between 6 and 12 months, depending on role, citizens have to return for repeated refresher courses in the following years. This is augmented by those attached to local defense units, who meet much more frequently and train much more regularly. The result is a force that's both capable and trained to a high level of readiness, yet also much larger than that of peer nations. Sweden, for example, has slightly more active personnel than Finland, but a mere 31,000 reservists. This, despite having double the population. Another thing the Finns have going for them is their willingness to fight. One of the main reasons the Russian warship didn't grind its way across the whole of Ukraine last year is that the population more or less unanimously agreed that it could go itself. That sort of determination can work wonders, and it's a determination the Finns also seem to have. Polls before and after Russia's full-scale invasion have shown that the number of Finns willing to fight and die for their country stands at over 3/4, one of the highest ratios in Europe. This may be why some Finns are currently calling for the gender restrictions on conscription to be scrapped. If this is the army Helsinki can field with just men and volunteer women, imagine what it could do if every woman aged 18 to 60 was also included.
Hey everyone, look, before we're all ready to start shooting things up, let's just try and give diplomacy a chance, all right? Because if this goes into the sequel we all dread, sooner or later the nukes will be a dropping, and then battle formations and everything else won't matter because we'll all be vaporized. It's easy to say these things right now while everything's still peachy and we still get to wake up and live our best lives as much as we can. I'm just saying, folks, the reality of the situation is far more grimdark than even I care to stomach. So it's easy to say, hey, I'm ready to fight and die, but then when you finally have to go toe-to-toe, then we'll see. I hope it doesn't come to that. We all get tested. But maybe there's still chance for all this to be avoided. I don't know. Perhaps maybe that's my inner old school Star Trek having some hope in me. I know I'm not a huge Star Trek fan, but I do find it comforting from time to time to see how people would solve their problems with words instead of pew-pew. But okay.
Especially since the military's now getting a cash injection. After years hovering just below the NATO-advised annual defense spending budget level of 2% of GDP, Finland will mark its first year in the alliance by boosting spending to 2.2%. That'll mean new equipment and weapon systems to bring Helsinki up to NATO standard. Not that it'll be a big jump. For such a small nation, Finland is already in possession of some seriously impressive kit.
No pun intended. That's my name.
Here's a comparison point for you if you want a quick way to envisage Finland's military capabilities. Imagine someone handed you full control of the armies of Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Poland. Now imagine your first order was for each of these nations to assemble all their artillery in one place. Well, congratulations, according to the Wilson Center, you'd still be looking at a smaller number of artillery than Helsinki alone can field. Overall, the Finnish army is known to have around 100 rocket launch systems, 700 howitzers, and 700 heavy mortars, for a total of 1,500. That's a total that includes the M270 multiple launch rocket systems, which can fire high-precision missiles over long distances in rapid succession, as well as South Korea's legendary K9 armored howitzers. Go looking at other branches of the military too, and you'll find equally impressive missile systems. The Air Force, for example, fields JASSM air-to-surface cruise missiles, while the Navy operates Israel's Gabriel 5 low-altitude anti-ship missiles. Much of this is thanks to a spending spree that defined much of the late 2010s and early 2020s, a spending spree that is still making its full impact felt. So let's look again at the Air Force, currently flying a fleet of FA-18 Hornet jets.
Okay, that's a reliable jet.
Just 2 years ago, in 2021, Helsinki inked a deal to upgrade the lot of them. Over the next 7 years, the fleet will be phased out and replaced with 64 of Lockheed Martin's F-35A Block 4.
Oh, that one. I'm sure they solved all the problems, but, you know, that plane had a lot of issues, and I think it still does to this very day.
That's a cutting-edge fighter jet, and it's not just the Air Force that's operating at such a high level. Back in 2014, the government upgraded its main battle tanks to German Leopard 2A6s, one of the best all-rounder tanks currently available. Overall, the spend has taken Finland's fleet to 312 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, enough to put Finnish forces on par with major European armies like France. The Navy likewise is undergoing modernization, with 4 Pajama-class multi-role corvettes currently under construction. At the same time, an emphasis is being put on expanding Finland's ability to conduct underwater warfare. This last bit gets at a key reason why NATO wanted Finland on site and why Russia desperately wanted to stop it happening. Or rather, 2 reasons. 2 separate bodies of water that the Finns can operate in better than most other NATO members: the Baltic Sea and the Arctic Ocean. So let's start with the Baltic Sea. If you look on a European NATO map dated before Finland joined, you might notice an obvious weak point. The three tiny Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Squashed up against Russia, Belarus, and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, the Baltic states are joined to the rest of NATO by only a 65-kilometer strip of Poland's northeast. When the Ukraine war first broke out, there were fears that Putin's next move might be to attack that region, to cut the Baltics off from resupply. With Finland on board, though, it becomes possible for NATO to resupply via water. Tallinn is only 70 kilometers from Helsinki across the waves, a short gap, which could also help the alliance cut off St. Petersburg, denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Up in the Arctic Ocean, it's a different story, but likewise an important one. While Finland doesn't actually have an Arctic coastline, its very north is cut off from the waters by Norway, the nation does happen to be very, very good at designing and building icebreakers. This is important because icebreakers are an area where Russia currently have a massive advantage. Moscow owns around 40 of them, meaning the chilly, ice-filled Arctic Ocean is the Kremlin's domain. Finland adds another 9 to NATO's fleet, but also the know-how and ability to manufacture more, a potentially vital skill as the planet warms and the northern sea route becomes ever more crucial. Rosy as this chapter has been, though, we wouldn't be doing our job if we just told you everything's going to be hunky-dory now that Finland is in the alliance. No, to really do this topic justice, we now need to turn our attention to the possible downsides, from potential deficiencies in the Finnish military to Russian plans to destabilize NATO's newest member.
I was looking at that map and I'm already just, yeah, it's easy to be an armchair general, but it just, some don't feel right. And it's one thing to say you want to take on, a conflict or getting ready to fight. It's another thing when it actually happens. And, I recently saw that film, All Quiet on the Western Front. And there's that scene where you have the German teacher cheering on all the young men and they're ready for an adventure. And then when they get to the front lines, it is not what it is. It's not a Charles Dixon story. It's not a story of her heroism. It's a story of absolute horror. Pure absolute horror. I hope it doesn't come to that. Oh boy. I feel pain in my stomach.
At the end of the second chapter today, we mentioned how Helsinki was boosting its military spend to over 2% of GDP. That's a lot of money, and as we pointed out, it will help with the purchase of even more top-of-the-range kit. However, we should note that Finland's post-Cold War military spending hasn't always been so generous. There have been two significant dips when funding dropped to barely 1% of GDP. First in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and second at the height of the Eurozone crisis. In both cases, spend subsequently recovered, but those cuts left deep scars. Scars that, especially in the latter case, have yet to fully heal. From 2012 to 2015, austerity forced the closure of multiple military bases. Closures that now look like potential gaps in a defensive line against Russian attack. In a 2022 article, War on the Rocks highlighted these closures as a significant issue should war break out, alongside Finland's lack of a large defense industrial base. When Finland does produce some world-class military equipment, most of the work is done by small businesses, which is great during peacetime, but a potential issue should conflict break out and the army require replacement kit as fast as possible. Still, these issues are relatively minor, something Finnish generals should probably bear in mind, but it's unlikely to seriously undermine Helsinki's defensive capacity. A far greater danger likely comes from across the eastern border. With Finland now in NATO, all of Vladimir Putin's most paranoid nightmares have suddenly come true, and that makes Russia a more acute threat than ever. To understand...
Nah, I'm not underestimating that guy. Even if he has his own issues, no. I've seen my fair share of crazy in my lifetime, all right? I've no.
Exactly how Putin sees the idea of Finland in NATO. We only need to look at a story told by President Sauli Niinisto. In a meeting with the Russian autocrat in 2016, he said Putin warned him, when we look across the border now, we see a Finn on the other side. If Finland joins NATO, we will see an enemy. The reasons for this aren't just Putin's obsession with stopping NATO expansion, they're also strategic. For one thing, NATO now almost totally surrounds the Baltic Sea, meaning the enclave of Kaliningrad could be cut off. The biggest strategic fear, though, is likely the Kola Peninsula. Directly bordering Finland's east, the peninsula is where Russia stations its northern fleet. With attack submarines and missile-bearing surface vessels, this is the fleet that's intended to destroy American supply ships in the event of a full-blown Russia-NATO conflict. Putin wants the alliance as far away from them as possible. More importantly, though, the Northern Fleet also maintains Russia's nuclear-armed submarines, the exact ones that are responsible for the nation's second strike capabilities. For Putin, having NATO anywhere near this peninsula is about as appetizing as you having your lunch anywhere near a giant messy dog poo. Already, the Kremlin has announced plans to boost troop numbers on the Finnish border and in the nearby Republic of Karelia. But with Moscow unlikely to have spare troops that it can free up from the Ukraine quagmire, Russia may well turn to hybrid warfare techniques to register its displeasure. And it's here that things start getting quite dicey. One fear of the Ukraine war has been Putin's repeated nuclear threats. Should NATO start to station personnel and equipment in Finland, it's possible these threats might get directed at Helsinki. Now, this is unlikely to involve Putin literally saying, "Hey Finland, I'm going to blow you up," but it might involve a more aggressive nuclear posture, including the redeployment of missiles. At the same time, so-called grey zone tactics might become the norm. You know, the stuff Russia used to be good at in the pre-Ukraine war era. The hacking, disinformation campaigns, election meddling, that sort of thing. Finns still have bitter memories of 2015 when Russian authorities suddenly sent 30,000 illegal immigrants across their border, a tactic Belarus would famously recycle in 2021 against Poland. The goal would be to destabilize Finnish society and cause ruptures, all at a minimum cost to Russia. Although how successful this is might be up for grabs. Back in 2015, the world was still unused to Moscow's hybrid warfare. Today, governments are a lot better prepared. In Finland's case, they're also prepared for a full-blown conflict. So it's time to end this video with perhaps the most interesting section of all, the Finnish plans for how to take on Russia in a future land war.
May it be avoided, because I just don't think it's going to end all pretty. That's all. Just, I want to hold out for hope, but having on hope is the first pass to disappointment. Just remember that. Normally when I check out Americans Learn, and I do these videos, yes, I am learning something interesting about the Finnish military capabilities, and all this sounds good on paper. And usually I like to add in a funny word here and there, but I have nothing funny to add here on this because the war is still ongoing. I know this video is about 11 months old, and last I checked, things are still not all hunky-dory in a place called Ukraine. And things are still dicey all over the world. In fact, it's getting a little bit hotter. Wasn't on my bingo card for World War III, but okay, here we go.
Perhaps the strangest feature of the Ukraine war is how unprepared either side was for the conflict. The Ukrainians only started making serious preparations in the last week, so afraid was the government of provoking Putin. The Kremlin, meanwhile, seems to have devised a plan that basically went, step 1, attack Ukraine, step 2, step 3, profit. Now, given all of that, it's a remarkable testament to Ukrainian will and courage that their army held the invaders off, but Helsinki hasn't placed all of its hopes in a similar coming together of society. Rather, the Finns are gambling on extensive preparations to bring them to victory. Known as comprehensive security, the plan requires the entire nation to effectively be ready for war to erupt at a moment's notice. That means a government body known as the National Emergency Supply Agency constantly maintaining 6-month stockpiles of food and fuel. It means all pharmacies and doctors working under a legal requirement to stockpile up to 10 months' worth of medicines. It even means architects and builders getting in on the act. Anyone who wants to construct a building above a certain size must include a bomb shelter. Meanwhile, the owners of underground civilian structures like car parks and swimming pools must have plans to quickly convert them into public shelters and evacuation centers. I remember the early days of the Ukraine war when social media was flooded with images of grandmas making Molotov cocktails and ordinary citizens lining up to get Kalashnikovs. Well, the Finnish method is to basically do with rigorous forward planning what the Ukrainians did semi-spontaneously. And that extends not just to people but also to businesses. If you live in Finland and head a business that in some way supports critical infrastructure, then you will almost certainly be called into regular meetings to go over your your plan of action for conflict. Some of this stuff is obvious. Telecoms companies needing to have backup systems to keep civilian lines of communication open. Food distributions making plans to how to keep people fed in wartime conditions. Other aspects, though, go beyond what you might expect. Toilet paper companies, for example, have systems for keeping the nation's bathrooms stocked in case of a blockade. More seriously, media organizations and the church are also required to map out how they will keep people informed of events in a crisis. NGOs must be ready to go at a moment's notice. In many ways, this total defense policy is made possible by conscription, which ensures all members of the elite are on the same page regarding threats. And
this all sounds good, right? All this sounds good on paper, but maybe this is completely not related, and it isn't. But I just can't help but think of this YouTube series, Fall of Civilization podcast, where they talk about the Bronze Age collapse and how the invasion of the Sea People happened. And there's a scene where the narrator is explaining how every empire at the time was dealing with the invasion of the Sea People. They were almost near invincible. The Egyptian Empire and all the other nations and city-states had to deal with them. And the narrator mentions like how you would expect that there would be like a union of these nations coming together, these city-states coming together, like a scene from Independence Day or from an alien invasion movie where the whole world unites and society unites. But that's not how things work. At the end of the day, people, humans, can be selfish creatures. Yes, we are capable of doing great things when we're together, but never, ever underestimate the selfishness of humanity and its survival of the fittest, and everyone's on their own. I like to think that all this sounds good, all this sounds great, but when it's finally put to the test, will the cracks show?
Just in case anyone has forgotten, the government runs national defense courses for politicians, business leaders, and media figures every year. Courses where they wargame how they and their industries would respond if word came that Russian tanks had crossed the border. Combine this with cycles of military training, and it's easy to see how sparsely populated Finland could be a force to be reckoned with. And that's not even including higher-level plans like mining the Baltic Sea or having combat aircraft take off on sorties from remote roads. Some wags on social media would put it, rather than have Finland join NATO, perhaps it would have been better to just have NATO join Finland. Still, we shouldn't get carried away. What Finland brings to the alliance won't be the equivalent to the superpower of the United States or to the nuclear-armed militaries of France and Britain, nor will it bring the sheer amount of investment that Poland recently has. What it will bring, though, is a highly adept, well-armed, and well-trained army that punches way above its weight. An army backed by a society that's more prepared to defend itself than almost any other nation in Europe. Combine all of this, and it's clear that the alliance's 31st member may just turn out to be one of its most valuable. Putin may have started his war hoping to halt NATO expansion. With the accession of Finland, though, the dictator has only ensured he now has a more than capable opponent right on his doorstep. So thanks for tuning in. Again, big thank you to our sponsor, Enlisted. If you're interested, check them out at...
Okay, so I'm sorry if I seem a little bit more pessimistic in this video. It's just, looking at this video when it came out, just to be clear, it's 11 months old. Fantastic. And it's from April 27th, 2023. What an innocent year that was. Well, not really. As far as I'm concerned, I could throw 2023 down the toilet. But, look, it is impressive to see what Finland is capable of. It is impressive to know that there is an industry and infrastructure put in place there to help protect the people. However, I would say, while this video does bring in some interesting perspectives and points of view, it's one thing to point out that when things are tested, it's when the cracks begin to show. Okay, and unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is still ongoing. And there's been talks about how they've lowered the enlistment age now to from 27 now to 25, and that there is still ongoing horrific bloody conflict taking place. Look, the world's been burnt enough. We've gone through plenty of conflicts before, and the last thing I think any one of us wants to see is the nukes be a-flying and mushroom clouds in the sky. looking at the severity of the situation, we are clearly dealing with a conflict and an escalation. It's one thing to say, hey, let's have diplomatic talks. And I know for many people that would say, well, that's impossible. The time for talk is over. But we got to make every effort for diplomatic solutions, every effort to talk. Because if people's emotions start getting way too high, if things start going too far, we may never get that opportunity again to talk. So I hope that the war, or no, there won't be any more future wars, but yet it's easier said than done because it seems like there's always going to be another conflict. With every day that passes on, there's always talk about another clash between nations. We have to be better. We not only do we have to be better to each other, we have to treat each other like brothers and sisters. But all I'm saying here is just words. This was a fantastic video, very informative, but I get a curious sense of unease and dread, knowing that at any point in time, if things do escalate, that's it. So make use of the time that you have now, and maybe, there will be a peace in our time. Just not today. Until then, folks, please take good care of yourselves and each other. Please support the original content creator. That link is in the description box below. Peace on Earth, and much love to you. Take care. I wish I could add more humor into this, but this is as real as it can get, and I really can't add too much comedy into this because there's nothing funny about it. Take good care, folks, and peace.